I was just sitting at your desk. I was like, you turned out to speak right now. Yeah. This evening, we're very excited that all of you came out for this special event. And I want to start by thanking our sponsors. The first one is the Middle East Institute of Columbia University, the Columbia Iranian Student Association, Peace Action New York State, Just Foreign Policy, Common Cause, World Policy Institute, Fellowship of Reconciliation, Physicians for Social Responsibility of New York, and the Iranian American Society of New York, the Cultures of Resistance Network, the Lee Gund Foundation. We have 4 speakers here this evening, and I'm going to start by reading a short bio for each of them. Our first speaker, Christopher Hedges. Christopher Hedges is a journalist and author specializing in American and Middle Eastern politics. He has spent nearly 20 years as a foreign correspondent in the Middle East, Central America, Africa, and Balkans, and has reported for the Christian Science Monitor, National Public Radio, the Dallas Morning News, and the New York Times. In 2002, Christopher Hedges received the Amnesty International Global Award for Human Rights Journalism and was part of a team that won the Pulitzer Prize for New York Times coverage of global terrorism. He has written several books, including War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning and American Fascist, the Christian Rights War on America. Our next speaker is Stephen Kinzer, who is an award-winning foreign correspondent who has covered more than 50 countries in over 5 continents. Kinzer's most recent book is Overthrow: America's Century of Regime Change from Hawaii to Iraq. Kinzer spent more than 20 years working in the New York Times covering Latin America, post-communist Europe, and Central Asia. He is also the author of All the Shah's Men, An American Coup, and The Roots of Middle Eastern Terror, Crescent and Star, Turkey Between the Two Worlds, and Kinzer's next book about Rwanda will be published in June. Mr. Bill Berkeley, he teaches human rights reporting at Columbia Graduate School of Journalism. He is a former editorial writer for the New York Times, previously a correspondent in Africa for the Atlantic Monthly. He is the author of The Graves Are Not Yet Full, a book about genocide in Africa. He is currently at work on a book about the Iranian hostage crisis of 1979 till 1981, focusing on the political revolution of surviving Iranian hostage takers. And our next speaker is Ervand Abrahamian. Ervand Abrahamian is an Armenian born in Iran and raised in England. He teaches world and Middle East history at the Baruch College of the City University of New York. He has published 2 books, Iran Between Two Revolutions, The Iranian Mujahideen, Khomeinism, Tortured Confessions, and Inventing the Axis of Evil. He has taught at Princeton University, New York University, and Oxford University. He is currently working on 2 books, one on the 1953 CIA coup in Iran and another on the history of modern Iran for Cambridge University Press. Thank you, gentlemen, for being here. My name is Sarah Saperi, and I was born in Tehran, Iran in 1980. I live in Toronto, Canada, and I work for an advertising company. I'm not a political major, nor have I really been involved in politics. I was asked here today by Peace Action to be a voice of humanity, to be a voice for the new Iranian generation. I find that it's not only my responsibility, but an absolute privilege to stand here before you and to moderate this panel. So that's a little bit about me. I'm going to turn it over to Chris, and Chris will speak first, and then we'll have Bill go next, and then Ervand Abrahamian, and then Mr. Kinzer, and we'll finish by about 8:30, and then at 8:30 we'll have half an hour for a question and answer period. Chris?
Tonight, in this talk about a possible war with Iran, by discussing the bill passed by the Senate and now before the House, which updates the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act known as FISA. It includes in this update a provision granting retroactive immunity to telecommunications companies that facilitated government spying. If this bill passes, it will have a direct impact on whether this administration or a future administration is able to wage a war on Iran or start other preemptive wars on false pretexts. The granting of immunity will make an investigation into one of the country's most pervasive intrusions of our civil liberties impossible. From the little we know, the spying was far more intrusive and comprehensive than perhaps anything we have endured in American history. Mark Klein, the AT&T whistleblower, explained how he attached all AT&T circuits, carrying every one of our phone calls, our emails, all of our web browsing into a secure room, room number 641-A, at Street Facility in San Francisco. There it was copied and sent to Homeland Security. I have felt the sting of this diminishing of our civil liberties. I was recently told about a showdown between a U.S. warship and Iranian gunboats that had the potential to escalate into military conflict. The U.S. warship had apparently entered Iranian territorial waters, taken over an abandoned Iranian oil rig, and was confronted by Iranian boats. The captain of the U.S. ship, who had been told to hold his ground, withdrew, fearing a confrontation, a decision that I heard saw him formally reprimanded. I was given the name of a sailor who was on the warship at the time of the alleged incident and reportedly had photographs of the standoff. His first question was whether my phone and my emails were being monitored. What could I say? How could I know? I offered to travel to see him, but frightened of retribution, he refused. I do not know if the story is true. I only know that the fear of surveillance made it impossible for me to determine its veracity. And I also know that with the publication of the National Intelligence Estimate, the Bush White House will need to manufacture a provocation, such as the one described, to launch a war with Iran. A nation that lacks the ability to discern the difference between the truth and a lie can no longer be called a democracy. If the sweeping surveillance law put into place by the president, essentially giving the U.S. government unchecked authority to eavesdrop on the phone calls and emails of innocent Americans, is allowed to stand, we will have eroded one of the most important bulwarks to a free press and an open society. This law will have terrible consequences, not only for us, but for nations our leaders define as hostile, such as Iran. Under this law, all those who hold information that could embarrass and expose the lies of those in power will have similar fears. Confidentiality and the understanding that as a reporter I will honor this confidentiality permits a free press to function. Take it away, and a free press withers and dies. If the pending cases against the telecom companies are dropped, we will never be able to uncover the details of this administration's illegal wiretapping program. AT&T, with $39 million in contributions to House and Senate candidates since 1990, is Congress's second largest financier. Verizon has spent $80 million to lobby Congress since 1998. The Senate folded on the issue by a vote of 68 to 29, and Hillary Clinton, by the way, never showed up to vote. The House is now considering the bill that includes this immunity, and given the clout of these corporations, I am not optimistic. The new law provides woefully inadequate safeguards to protect innocent people whose communications are caught up in the government's dragnet surveillance program. The law passed under the guise of national security is ostensibly directed at people outside the country. It will easily ensnare, however, many, perhaps all, communications between Americans and those overseas. Those communications can be stored indefinitely and disseminated, not just to the U.S. government, but to other governments as well. This law cripples the work of those of us who, as reporters, communicate regularly with people overseas, especially to those in the Middle East. It intimidates dissidents, human rights activists, and courageous officials who seek to expose the lies of our government or governments allied with us. It hangs like the sword of Damocles over all who dare to defy official versions of events. It leaves open the possibility of retribution and invites the potential for abuse by those whose concern is not with the truth and freedom, but the consolidation of power and the prosecution of preemptive wars. I, along with other journalists, human rights organizations, and defense attorneys who also rely on confidentiality to do their work, have joined the ACLU lawsuit that will be brought if the House passes this law challenging its legality. I have joined not only because this law takes aim at my work, but because it signals a serious erosion of safeguards that make possible our democratic state. Laws and their just application are the only protection we have as citizens. Once the law is changed to permit the impermissible, we have no recourse with which to fight back. I know the cost of terrorism and the consequences of war. I spent 20 years as a foreign correspondent, most of them with the New York Times. I investigated al-Qaeda's operations in Europe and North Africa for the paper and have covered conflicts in Central America, Africa, the Middle East, and the Balkans. The monitoring of suspected terrorists with proper oversight is a critical part of our national security. But this law is not about keeping us safe, which can and should be done in a constitutional manner and with judicial oversight. It is about using terrorism to permit wholesale spying and silence voices that will allow us to maintain an open society. And I begin tonight's discussion of Iran by mentioning the impending loss of one of the most vital instruments we have to prevent illegal preemptive wars. I begin our discussion about a possible war with Iran by warning you that should the confidentiality we need as free citizens be taken away from us, a war with Iran will become easier to unleash. The most effective diplomats, like the most effective intelligence officers and foreign correspondents, and I stand near one of them, Stephen Kinzer, possess empathy. They have the intellectual, cultural, and linguistic literacy to get inside the heads of those they must analyze to cover. They know the vast array of historical, religious, economic, and cultural antecedents that go into making up decisions and reactions. And because of this, they are less prone to blunders, endowed with the ability to communicate, and more able to find ways of resolving conflicts through mutual understanding and diplomacy. But we live in an age where dialogue is dismissed and empathy is suspect. We prefer the illusion that we can dictate events through force. It hasn't worked in Iraq, it hasn't worked in Afghanistan, and it won't work in Iran. But those who once tried to reach out and understand, who developed expertise to explain the world to us and ourselves to the world, no longer have a voice in the new imperial project. We are governed and informed by moral and intellectual trolls. We must perceive how others see us. We must grasp how they think about us and be sensitive to their own fears and insecurities. But this is becoming hard to accomplish. Our embassies are packed with analysts whose main attribute is long service in the armed forces and who frequently report to intelligence agencies rather than the State Department. Our area specialists in the State Department are ignored by the ideologues driving foreign policy. Their complex view of the world is an inconvenience, and foreign correspondents are an endangered species along with foreign coverage. We are intoxicated by the language of violence. The proposed $20 billion arms supply package for the Gulf countries is the newest forms of weapons systems as message. U.S. Undersecretary of State Nicholas Burns was blunt about the deal. He told the International Herald Tribune the arms package says to the Iranians and Syrians that the United States is a major power in the Middle East and will continue to be and is not going away. The arrogant call for U.S. hegemony over the rest of the globe is making enemies of a lot of people who might be predisposed to support us, even in the Middle East. And it is terrifying those such as the Iranians, Iraqis, and Syrians who we have demonized. Empathy and knowledge, the qualities that make real communication possible, have been discarded. We use tough talk and big weapons deals to communicate. We spread fear, distrust, and violence, and we expect missile systems to protect us. Imagine an Iranian government that was powerful, radical, and in possession of nuclear weapons. Imagine the threat that would pose to Israel and to the American-led balance of power, which has been so important in the Middle East since the close of the Second World War, Burns said in a speech last year. This is our first challenge. Our second challenge is that Iran continues to be the central backer of Middle East terrorism, he went on. It is the leading founder and director of Hamas, Hezbollah, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine General Command. Third, Iran is, in our judgment, a major violator of human rights of its own people. It denies religious, political, and press rights to the people of a very great country representing a very great civilization. And so we see a problem that is going to be with us for a long time, and we are trying to fashion a strategy that will work for the long term. George Bush's rhetorical salvos are more of the same. Iran's active pursuit of technology that could lead to nuclear weapons threatens to put a region already known for instability and violence under the shadow of a nuclear holocaust, he said. Bush has warned that the United States must confront Iran before it is too late. War with Iran, a war that would unleash an apocalyptic scenario in the Middle East, remains a possibility. I do not know when or finally if, an attack on Iran will take place. But I do know that all the pieces in the chessboard are in place, that the rhetoric and propaganda is geared toward preparing the United States for a massive attack on Iran, and that the safeguards that permit a free and open debate in this country are being eroded, making such a war easier to orchestrate. Let us hope sanity prevails. But sanity is a rare commodity in a White House which has perverted Leon Trotsky's concept of permanent revolution into a concept of permanent war, with, of course, the same nefarious aims: to intimidate and destroy all those classified as foreign opponents, to create permanent instability and fear, and to silence domestic critics who challenge leaders in a time defined as national crisis. It works. Most of the citizens of the United States, slowly being stripped of basic civil liberties, are powerless, compliant, and afraid. And if you doubt me, take a look at the Democratic Party. George Bush, claiming to be anointed by a Christian God to reshape the world, and especially the Middle East, defined 3 states at the start of his reign as the axis of evil. They were Iraq, now occupied; North Korea, which because it has a nuclear weapon is untouchable; and Iran. He has turned his Middle East planning to neoconservative ideologues such as Elliott Abrams, a convicted felon who helped orchestrate the disastrous and illegal Contra war in Nicaragua, and who now handles the Middle East for the National Security Council. Abrams knew nothing about Central America. He knows nothing about the Middle East. The last best hope for averting a war with Iran lies with the United States military. The Congress, cowed by the Israeli lobby and terrified of appearing weak on defense before the presidential elections, will do little to halt an attack. The media, especially the electronic press, is working overtime to whip up fear of a nuclear Iran and tar Tehran with abetting attacks against American troops in Iraq. The wall of defense that prevents the Bush administration from targeting Iran runs through the offices of the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, Admiral William Fallon, the head of the Central Command, CENTCOM, and General George Casey, the Army's Chief of Staff. These 3 figures in the defense establishment know how depleted the U.S. military has become, that it cannot manage another conflict, and that a war with Iran would make a war with Iraq look like an act of prudence and common sense. The reliance on the military command, however, to be the voice of reason in the debate about a new war is not a healthy sign for our deteriorating democracy. Compliant generals can always be found to carry out the Dr. Strangelove designs of a crazed White House. And this White House has a habit of dismissing generals, recalcitrant generals, such as General Eric Shinseki. The White House, isolated and reviled at home and abroad, believes it is on a higher mission to save the world from itself. And the instability in the Middle East could undermine Gates and his generals. A limited Israeli strike on suspected Iranian nuclear production facilities under discussion in Jerusalem could trigger retaliatory strikes by Iran on Israel and U.S. targets in Iraq and the Persian Gulf. The clamor for revenge, fueled by a rapacious right-wing media, coupled with our feelings of collective humiliation, could sweep aside all reasoned objections to war with Iran. It happened after the attacks of 2001. It can happen again. There is a petition circulating that was put together by Marcy Winograd from the Progressive Democrats. The petition is addressed to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and all U.S. military personnel. It urges them to defy orders to attack Iran. It points out that a preemptive war with Iran is a war crime under international law. Iran has not attacked the United States. The U.S., as a party and signatory to the UN Charter, would be in violation of international law and the laws enshrined in the Constitution if it went to war with Iran. If the citizens and their representatives in Congress refuse to resist and uphold the rule of law, perhaps the military can be prodded to halt our slide into despotism. It is not the best option, but it may be one of the few options left. The debate about Iran is eerily familiar. The man who played Cassandra in the war with Iraq, who warned us of our folly and the delusions of those who advocated invasion and occupation, has reappeared, looking somewhat like the ghost in Hamlet on stage. Mohammed al-Baradei, the Nobel Prize-winning head of the International Atomic Energy Agency, says that while there is evidence that Iran has hidden some of its nuclear activities from the agency, there is no firm evidence that it is in fact developing nuclear weapons or diverting materials from its civilian nuclear program. The Iranians, like us, are cursed by their leadership. President Mahmoud Ahmadinejad is as primitive, inept, and paranoid as George Bush. They are the perfect dance partners for a waltz into Armageddon. The upcoming parliamentary elections in March, where Ahmadinejad and his allies are expected to lose support, puts pressure on him to raise his profile. He has an incentive to pick a fight with the United States, something he has done in the past, hoping that the confrontation will boost his sagging popularity. He can do this or negotiate, provided we are willing to negotiate. The nuclear impasse. This was an offer given to us by Mohammed Khatami in 2003, one we foolishly turned down. The hypocrisy of this newest moral crusade is not lost on those in the Middle East. Iran signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Iran has violated a codicil of that treaty, written by European foreign ministers, but that codicil was never ratified by the Iranian parliament. I suspect Iran does, by the way, intend to eventually acquire nuclear weapons. I do not want to minimize the danger, should it acquire them, in the estimated 5 to 10 years. But contrast Iran with Pakistan, India, and Israel. These three countries refused to sign the treaty. They developed nuclear weapons programs in secret. Israel now has an estimated 400 to 600 nuclear weapons. And the word Dimona, the name of the city where the nuclear facilities are located in Israel, is shorthand in the Muslim world for the deadly threat to the Muslim world's existence. What lessons did the Iranians learn from our Israeli, Pakistani, and Indian allies? What lessons have been learned by other countries in the region? These nations saw that the United States did not concern itself with international law and treaties when its allies secretly built nuclear weapons. These treaties and international laws only counted for Washington's enemies. Is it any wonder that Egypt, Jordan, and Saudi Arabia have all expressed a desire for a nuclear capacity? All efforts short of war must be made to stop Iran from obtaining nuclear devices. But if we fail, we must be prepared to live with a nuclear Iran. It is only a matter of time before more states, including failed states, acquire these weapons. And attacking Iran, while it may retard the Iranian program, will spur dozens of other nations into the arms race. John Abizaid, the retired Army general who headed Central Command for nearly 4 years, said that if Iran gained nuclear weapons, the United States could deter it from using them. The Iranians are aware, he said, that the United States has a far superior military capability. I believe that we have the power to deter Iran should it become nuclear, he said, referring to the theory that Iran would not risk a catastrophic retaliatory strike by using a nuclear weapon on the United States. A war with Iran would be different from a war with Iraq. It really could usher in the apocalyptic nightmares spun out in the dark, fantastic visions of the Christian right. And there are those around the president who see this vision as preordained by God. The United States is able to launch a massive and devastating air attack on Iran's military installations. It can obliterate its ill-equipped and tiny air force. It can cripple, if not dismantle, effective communications and military command and control. It can destroy some of Iran's underground nuclear facilities. But our intelligence inside Iran, as was true in Iraq, is uneven. We do not know where all of these facilities are, and it is probable that an Iranian response against American targets such as the Green Zone in Iraq, as well as Iranian-sponsored terrorist attacks on American soil, would follow. Shiites in the region would interpret an attack as a war on the Shiite community and would unleash unrest and violence against us and our allies from Lebanon to Pakistan. The disaster in southern Lebanon, where the Israeli air campaign not only failed to break Hezbollah, but united most Lebanese behind the militant group, is a good example of what would happen if we carried out airstrikes on Iran. The massive Israeli bombing failed to pacify 4 million Lebanese. What will happen when we begin to pound a country of 70 million people whose landmass is 4 times the size of France? But more ominously, an attack on Iran will ignite the Middle East. The loss of Iranian oil, coupled with silkworm missile attacks by Iran on oil tankers in the Persian Gulf, would send oil soaring to over $200 a barrel. The price of oil would certainly double the moment war began. The effect on the domestic and world economy would be devastating. The 2 million Shiites in Saudi Arabia, the Shiite majority in Iraq, and the Shiite communities in Bahrain, Pakistan, and Turkey will turn in rage on us and our dwindling allies. We will see a combination of increased terrorist attacks and the widespread sabotage of oil production in the Gulf. Iraq, as bad as it looks now, will become a death pit for American troops. The country, however, that will pay the biggest price will be Israel. And the sad irony is that those planning this war think of themselves as allies of the Jewish state. A conflagration of this magnitude could see Israel drawn back into Lebanon and sucked into a regional war, one that would over time perhaps spell the final chapter in the Zionist experiment in the Middle East. The Israelis call their nuclear program the Samson Option. The biblical Samson ripped down the pillars of the temple and killed everyone around him, along with himself. It may be a sad and apt metaphor. George Bush has shredded, violated, or absented America from its obligations under international law. He has refused to sign the Kyoto Protocol, backed out of the Anti-Ballistic Missile Treaty, tried to kill the International Criminal Court, walked out on negotiations on chemical and biological weapons, and defied the Geneva Convention and human rights law in the treatment of detainees in our offshore penal colonies where we engage in medieval forms of torture. Most egregiously, he launched an illegal war in Iraq based on fabricated evidence we now know had been discredited even before it was made public. He has expressed a desire to do the same in Iran. The President is guilty, in short, of what in legal circles is known as the crime of aggression. And if we as citizens do not hold him accountable for these crimes, if we do not actively defy his administration and support impeachment, we will be complicit in the codification of a new world order, one that will have terrifying consequences. For a world without treaties, statutes, and laws is a world where any nation, from a rogue nuclear state to a great imperial power, will be able to invoke its domestic laws to annul its obligations to others. This new order will undo 5 decades of international cooperation, largely put in place by the United States, and thrust us into a Hobbesian nightmare. A rule-based world matters. If we demolish the fragile and delicate international order, if we permit George Bush to create a world where diplomacy, broad cooperation, and the law are worthless, if we allow these international legal systems to unravel, we will see our own moral and political authority plummet. We will erode the possibility of cooperation between nation states, including our closest allies, and see visited upon us the evils we visit on others. Our nation has been rendered deaf and dumb. We no longer have the capacity for empathy. We prefer to amuse ourselves with trivia and gossip that pass for news rather than understand. We are blinded by our military prowess. We believe that huge explosions and death are an effective form of communication, and the rest of the world is learning to speak our language. The scenario that faces us requires those of us as citizens to act. The Democratic Party, which does not have the stomach to halt the war in Iraq, has made it clear it will cheer on our self-immolation should we go to war with Iran. A country that exists in a state of permanent war cannot exist as a democracy. Our long row of candles is being snuffed out. and we will soon be in darkness. I ask you to join me, if we should go to war with Iran, in refusing to pay your income tax. Put the money in an escrow account. Dispute this. Go to court. Maybe a few courageous judges will rule that the Constitution has been usurped and the government is guilty of what the post-war Nuremberg laws defined as a criminal war of aggression. Maybe, maybe not. I no longer know. But I do know this. I have friends in Tehran, in Gaza, in Beirut, in Baghdad, in Jerusalem and Cairo. And even if our efforts of resistance fail, we should at least muster enough integrity and courage so when the slaughter is over, we will have earned the right to ask for their forgiveness. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris. Our next speaker is Dr. Abrahamian.
I have a petition on the website, so if you want to go to the website, if you agree with it, I would appreciate your signatures. It's a letter to the leadership in Iran expressing...
Can you stand up at the podium? It's really better.
The website is www.cpdweb.org. Now,
Could you repeat that, please?
yes, cpdweb.org. A few months ago, I would have fully agreed with Chris's very eloquent and alarmist view. Probably in a few months' time or a year's time after the November election, I will agree with him again. But at the moment, I think the concern and the worry about imminent war has diminished. So what I want to look at is why the danger is diminished, the rhetoric has been toned down, but why, underlying that, there are still major concerns and why the issue might be revived, especially after the November elections here. A few months ago, if you looked at the rhetoric, it had really hit a pitched height. People there at the White House were talking that U.S. and Iran were already in the midst of a war. This was World War IV. The Cold War being World War III, that basically there was a life and death struggle between the U.S. and Iran. People in the White House were describing Iran with such terms as hegemonic, interventionist, aggressive, expansionist, warlike. Incidentally, of course, without any sense of irony here. As is often said, a sense of irony seems to have died in Washington some time ago. To be precise, the day Kissinger accepted the Nobel Peace Prize. But this rhetoric has clearly been toned down on both sides, especially over here. A number of reasons. One is obviously the NIE report that really pulled the rug out from the hawkish policy. But more than that, there is a real change in Washington of guard. The neoconservatives have been really eased out, and the people in power are, I would call, much more old-fashioned conservatives. And I think from a left perspective or a liberal perspective, there may not be that much difference between them. But I think if you want to analyze their attitude, especially to war, there is a fundamental difference between, I would say, old-fashioned conservatives and the people I prefer to call neo-crazies rather than neoconservatives, because there is this fascination, which I don't think one finds in Western writing, Western civilization, really since 1918, about the virtues of war. Some of the intellectuals involved among the neoconservatives are actually advocate war, not as a necessity, but something that is good. It produces masculinity, it produces virtue, it produces virility. These are not sort of things you would hear from old-fashioned conservatives. In fact, these are sort of things you would hear in the 1930s, various strange people running around rampant in the Central Europe were talking like that. And in Western civilization, this really disappeared into the woodwork. But after 2000, it really reappeared. I would say, actually, in the year 2000, the Gotha came to power in the United States, and sort of ideas that were very on the fringes of politics became mainstream. And part of this was that basically the war is good. It's not a last resort, but it's it's something to go to quite freely. But this is not a view that would be held by conservatives such as Gates or Rice or people like Admiral Fallon, who are much more, I think, know about war. These ideas about war and virtue is much more ideas held by armchair conservatives, not people who know anything about the process of war. So I think this change has made in Washington has produced actually a drastic left an impact on how to deal with Iran. A third reason, of course, is that I think the conservatives, being much more realistic, know what is down the line if the U.S. did attack Iran. Clearly, they know that the U.S. position in both Afghanistan and Iraq is very fragile, that they need Iran to actually get some sort of semblance of normality there. I don't think they'll get it, but they hope that somehow they will get the news from those two countries off the front pages for the next few months anyway. And to do that, of course, they need Iran's help to this. And of course, the other side of it is, of course, if Iran is attacked, Iran can retaliate in both those places and turn the place which is already a nightmare into a worse nightmare. And as someone like Brzezinski, who I would put in the sort of conservative stream, has said that if the U.S. did attack Iran, it would turn into a 30-year war, where U.S. would have to send an army of 1 million or 2 million. Of that, of course, would include the reintroduction of the draft. So people who think rationally along the line, they know what would be the eventual possibilities there of an air attack on Iran. So I think as long as the conservatives are now in the driver's seat, we can relax. But having said that, there is, I think, underlying the whole issue, fundamental conflict between Iran and United States. It's not just a question of rhetoric. It is basically an inherent contradiction, I would say, especially on the nuclear policy. Iran's position is clear-cut, that it has the right to have the full nuclear cycle, to have the capability of producing nuclear energy. That's become basically a national policy. It's lumped together with national sovereignty, national independence, national right, and it's, of course, all spelled out also in terms of the Non-Proliferation Treaty. Some people say that this is just an excuse to get the nuclear bomb. I don't think so. It doesn't follow that. It would makes much more sense for Iran to have nuclear capability to produce a bomb rather than to produce a bomb. A bomb itself would be a dud. would be an albatross. It would actually undermine Iran's position in the Middle East. I don't have time to go into that, why that is so, but what I think Iran wants is not the bomb itself, but the capability of building a bomb if it ever has to, such as in the situation it was faced when Saddam Hussein was using chemicals and gas on Iran. Iran actually is not demanding something that is so outrageous. It's called the Japanese option in the nuclear profession. Japan has the capability of producing a bomb if it wants to. And it's not just Japan. There's some 39 other countries who have that capability. And that's, I think, what Iran would be doing, because that's probably the rational thing for them to do. But where the contradiction comes in is the U.S. has been adamant that Iran is not mature enough. Iran is not reliable enough to have this capability. That the U.S. argues that actually Iran is building a bomb, but it knows that what it's heading for is the capability, but the capability for the United States is a taboo. It's not something acceptable. And as long as you have these two contradictory positions, there's obviously a possibility of a confrontation. If neither side is going to budge, there is basically, after the election, this issue is going to again emerge, especially, of course, we have a warmonger in the White House. What is the only out of this position? I don't see Iran would be able to actually move out of its position because, first of all, it fits into its national interest to have the capability of a bomb. If I was in their position, that's what I think any rational person would want to have, so, especially with the experience of the Iraqi war. And the way, of course, it's seen is very much a repetition of 1953 crisis, the oil crisis. And in fact, it's much of it resonates with the public because it seems like a replay of that. At that time, some of you might not know or remember, the British attitude was that Iran wasn't really mature enough, reliable enough to run such an important industry such as oil. Westerners had to do it. And every time now the U.S. says that, well, Iran isn't really mature enough to have the high technology, the cutting edge of technology, which is nuclear science, it should be basically kept out of Iranian hands. It really resonates as bring back the memories of the 51-53 crisis. So I can't see the Iranian position the Iranian leaders backing down on this issue. They're willing to, I think, give guarantees that they will not produce a bomb, and they're willing to negotiate with al-Baradei about that. But to actually stop the nuclear process is not something that is negotiable for them. From the American side, I think the only way there can be avoidance of a confrontation is actually if the United States backed down from its present position and said that U.S. could live with Iran if Iran had the capability but did not actually go full hog and develop the bomb, which would basically be returning to the Japanese option. And since the United States can live with 39 or 40 other countries that have this option, I don't think it would be a major deal if Iran also had that option. I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. Great to see such a big turnout for an important subject like this. I want to thank Melissa Van and Sarah and your colleagues for organizing this. We're short on time, so I'm going to try to be as brief as I can and then open the floor to Stephen Kinzer and then your questions. If I could step back, and I think in the balance of the presentations now, rather than focusing on what's going to happen between the United States and Iran. I'm going to be speaking, and I think Stephen Kinzer will too, on things that have already happened in the past. Stephen Kinzer will be talking about the 1953 coup, his book, All the Shah's Men. I highly recommend to all of you a fantastic book about the 1953 coup and America's complicity in it. The book I'm working on is about the hostage crisis of 1979 to 1981. I'm focusing on the political careers and the political evolution of the surviving Iranian hostage takers. Most of you who are familiar with the pathological relationship between the United States and Iran will know that the hostage crisis of 79 to 81 occupies a special place in the American psyche, and I think to this day helps explain a lot of how difficult it is for Americans to imagine Iran as anything other than an implacably hostile and alien foe. Likewise, I think Stephen would agree the 53 coup occupies an analogous place in the Iranian psyche. My question in my research is not so much what should we do about Iran, but what should we make of Iran? And I went to Iran, made 4 trips to Iran to meet some of the surviving Iranian hostage takers, all of whom, as it turns out, and this is one of the reasons I'm curious about them, are exactly my age. I graduated from college in 1979. That was the year of the Iranian Revolution, and the hostage crisis began. The hostage takers were young students then, some as young as 18, 19 years old, most of them in their early 20s, now in middle age, and my book is a Where Are They Now kind of a narrative. Most of the surviving Iranian hostage takers are leading figures in Iran's embattled reform movement, in vehement opposition to the ruling mullahs in whose name they acted in their youth. So it's even in the what for us is the exotic terrain of an alien power, a recognizable trajectory that many of us can probably appreciate, from student radicalism to a more moderate and more measured middle age, although these are folks who have paid a greater price for their evolution than most of us have. A number of them have been jailed, some in solitary confinement for extended periods, for practicing independent journalism, for example. One, a very prominent figure, Saeed Hajarian, was shot in the face in an assassination attempt by the secret police in 2000. Another, Abbas Abdi, became a prominent journalist in the late 1990s and was jailed and held in solitary confinement for more than a year in 2000. A third character, Mohsen Mirdamadi, was beaten up within an inch of his life in a public rally not long ago. So these are characters who have gone from deep inside the revolution, and a number of them played prominent roles in the early years of the revolution in the Iran-Iraq War, to the sidelines, and some of them paying a heavy price. I mentioned surviving Iranian hostage takers because a great number, some say as many as 200 or 300 of the hostage takers were killed in the Iran-Iraq War. And in fact, 40 former hostage takers killed in a single battle of Hoveza in 1982. And for those of you who are not Iranians, have never been to Iran, it's a fact of the recent history of Iran that hits you over the head like a hammer as a visitor, the lasting legacies of the Iran-Iraq War, and among the lessons that Iranians learned, the role that the United States played during that war, backing Saddam Hussein. The experience as an American traveling to Iran is one of again and again being held a mirror into your face and being reminded of all kinds of history that is deep in the psyche and memories of Iranians that most of us Americans have all but totally forgotten. Certainly the Iran-Iraq War is a part of that. In my short time, just a couple of quotes, if I will, from my interviews with the former hostage takers. Steve, I might point out that many of the hostage takers, as an American, you go over there and you say, why did you do it? Why did you seize the American embassy? What were you thinking? and all of them will cite the '53 coup as the background to their thinking. They were afraid that the United States was plotting another coup, and from their point of view, the hostage-taking was a rational calculation of national self-interest. But at the same time, these very young students and anyone who's ever been involved in student radicalism will recognize this. The hostage takers, from the vantage point of middle age, look back on their student activism with a measure of chagrin. They really didn't know what they were doing. They got in over their heads. They thought they were going to hold a sit-in for a matter of 2 or 3 days. They had the bright idea that they would seize hostages. They didn't know very much about the rest of the world. They imagined the rest of the world would rally to their defense and their cause. They especially imagined that young American students, perhaps veterans of Vietnam protests, would immediately recognize the merit in their anti-imperialist cause and rally to their defense. And alas, it didn't quite work out that way. And the hostage seizure went on for 14 months and was an enormous, not just a diplomatic crisis for the United States, which we Americans remember well, those of us old enough to remember, but a national calamity for Iran itself that reinforced and consolidated in power a regime that at this late date, I think the great majority of Iranians loathe and despise and fear. It also in large part precipitated the Iran-Iraq War, gave Saddam Hussein an opening to attack Iran. Some of the hostage takers acknowledge that. But most of the hostage takers in middle age look back and acknowledge their own folly. I'll just read one quote from a woman named Alahe Mojarradi, who was an 18-year-old high school senior in 1979 when she became a guard on the embassy grounds. And then she later married Mohsen Mirdamadi, one of the top 3 ringleaders of the hostage takers. It's a part of the experience of student radicals, perhaps down through the ages, a romantic atmosphere in which relationships were formed. One of the things you learn is that a large proportion of the most prominent hostage takers met their spouses during the hostage affair. And in fact, Alahe Mojarradi, as I was completing the second of 2 long interviews with her, a plump, rosy-cheeked, middle-aged woman, lovely woman, I asked her about her family as a courtesy, and it turns out she had 3 sons. And I asked about their ages, and it turned out one was about 24 years old at the time of this interview, and I did the math in my head, and it would appear that he would have had to have been conceived during the early months of the hostage affair. And here's her quote. "It was the value of justice that led me to participate in the event. Our revolution wasn't really made by politically minded people. We were passionate, we were idealists, but we were not particularly sophisticated. Even leaders were not particularly sophisticated. It was about idealism and passion, not political sophistication." In just the few minutes I have, if I could draw a few lessons relevant to our conversation today. One, I would say, is that Iran is not what it seems from afar. It's a more complicated place. It's a more human face. It's not as abstract a place. It's much more dynamic. It's a more evolving place. And it's a place that reacts to us as much as we react to Iran. Secondly, there's a moral ambiguity to the evolution of the hostage takers. Not all of them emerge covered in sympathy. Many Iranians remain bitter toward the hostage takers. The hostage crisis itself, largely deplored by most Iranians today. And that moral ambiguity around the hostage takers and their evolution is a moral ambiguity, I would argue, that one could apply to all sides in this conflict. It's a much more morally ambiguous environment that we're venturing into when we venture into the Iranian-American estrangement. Third, Islam. In all of my conversations with the hostage takers in 4 visits, many hours in conversations about what they were thinking, what were their motives, what are they thinking now, unless I ask, the word Islam doesn't come up. As a journalist, something I teach to my journalism students, the hazards of dwelling on exotica. These folks had all sorts of motives, and they have all sorts of motives now, but religious piety figured relatively low in their calculus at the time and since. And it's a point we should bear in mind as we think about radical Islam. Iran itself has its own trajectory in experiencing Islam. Many Iranians speaking of being a post-Islamic society. They've learned their lesson. They roll their eyes when they see Sunni Arabs preaching Islam. We need to ask ourselves, what do we learn when we use language like Islam? I would argue it's a term that obscures more than it illuminates. And finally, in understanding Iran, calculating Iranian interests, Iranian motives, and how we should respond, I would argue that the key to understanding Iran and the hostage takers' evolution, and the hostage takers themselves told me this, lies not in understanding what for us is an exotic religion that we don't understand, but in the timeless universal exigencies of power, including money. What's going on in Iran right now, the hostage takers, still a part of it, is a struggle for power. We have a role in that, sometimes to our detriment and the detriment of those whom we would likely like to see prevail in that struggle. But understanding Iran requires understanding power. It requires, an old journalistic phrase, following the money. And finally, I would argue, a sense of humility. If I could just conclude with a quote from the top hostage taker, a man named Ibrahim Asgharzadeh, was the leading conspirator in the hostage crisis. He was the leading spokesman for the hostage takers in 1979. You can go to the Museum of Radio and Television downtown and see Peter Jennings' broadcasts and Nightline broadcasts of these young bearded hostage takers chanting death to America and denouncing American imperialism. In hindsight, Asgharzadeh told me, I asked him what he thought of America back then, and Asgharzadeh said, the question of what the U.S. was all about, the complexity of it, we didn't see these complexities. What we saw of the U.S. was one block, one thing, one big black box. And he said, we don't see the complexities. 25 years ago, I didn't see those complexities the way I do now. I have since learned that things are more complicated. I would argue that we could learn the same lessons ourselves in looking at Iran. It is not one big black box. It's a complex society, and we should try to understand it with some humility and some recognition. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Berkeley. And now, Stephen Kinzer.
Thanks, Sarah. Thank all of you for coming out here. This is an issue that I hope is not going to fall off the American agenda over the next 11 months. I think that all of us need to bear in mind that there's always going to be the danger that at some point during this period we're going to wake up to the news that there might be a bombing campaign underway against Iran, and it would be terrible for us from a very selfish point of view to have to look in the mirror and ask ourselves whether we really did enough, and then to realize that we didn't make this part of our political agenda. So I hope it's something that we'll stay conscious of. You heard a lot about the 1953 overthrow of the last democratic government of Iran, which the United States engineered in cooperation with Britain. When I was researching my book about that coup in the Truman Library in Missouri, I found a great quote from Truman, which I later went on to use as the epigram for this book. He says, "There is nothing new in this world except the history you do not know." I actually want to lead a campaign to have that chiseled on the Oval Office wall. Our leaders tend to have a different view. During the hostage crisis at a press conference, President Carter was asked by one journalist, "Do you think the United States did the right thing in overthrowing Prime Minister Mossadegh in 1953 against the will of the Iranian people?" And his answer was, That's ancient history. It didn't seem that way to Iranians. Now, let me just make 2 points in my very brief couple of minutes here. First of all, you heard, and many of us can easily imagine, what some of the terrible consequences of an American attack on Iran would be. But I think one thing you learn when you study the aftermath of the 1953 coup is that the worst effects were ones that nobody could possibly have predicted at that time. Very briefly, we placed the Shah back on his peacock throne. The Shah ruled with increasing repression for 25 years. His repression produced the Islamic Revolution of the late 1970s. That revolution inspired radical fundamentalists in other countries, including next door Afghanistan, where the Taliban came to power and gave shelter to al-Qaeda with results that we all know. The instability that followed that revolution inside Iran led Iran's great enemy, Saddam Hussein, next door in Iraq, to launch an invasion of Iran. That not only produced the horrific Iran-Iraq war that produced more than 1 million casualties, it also led the United States into its death embrace with Saddam. Of course, we were military allies of Saddam Hussein in that war and provided him with valuable intelligence and equipment that he used to fight Iran. That death embrace with Saddam is what spiraled us down into the quagmire we now face in Iran. That revolution also terrified the Soviets because they were afraid of other fundamentalist revolutions along their southern frontier. That led the Soviets to invade Afghanistan. That in turn brought the United States into that part of the world to begin training tens of thousands of jihadis in how to fight the evil infidel, who we of course later became. And those people we trained became the Taliban. There was no person in 1953 who possibly could have imagined all of these consequences. And I think that's a great lesson for today, that we can imagine a lot of terrible consequences from an American attack on Iran. But I truly believe that the lesson of history tells us the worst consequences would be ones that we can't even imagine at this moment. I want to mention one other thing, and that's something that I think is the next logical step. We are all hoping fervently, possibly as a result of our work or as acts of God, that somehow we will not be winding up bombing Iran in the next 11 months and we're not going to have another war in the Middle East. And that would be a great achievement. We have reached, this is the point to which we have fallen. If we just don't bomb another country, we consider that to be a huge achievement. So I think that's a worthwhile goal for the next 11 months. But it really isn't enough. Even for the United States, a long-term foreign policy toward a country cannot be just, we're not going to bomb you. There needs to be something else. And that something else, in the case of Iran, is something that actually holds out tantalizing possibilities. I believe the United States ought to offer Iran direct, unconditional, bilateral, comprehensive negotiations in which all issues will be on the table. Let Iran list all of its complaints about the U.S., let the U.S. list all of its complaints about Iran, and let us agree to negotiate these issues in a peaceful way rather than trying to resolve them on the battlefield. This is the same way the United States began its breakthrough with China. What I think would happen if the United States made an offer like this is that, first of all, there would be quite a series of events inside Iran itself. You'd have different factions in that very complicated regime suddenly arguing with each other. Is this a good idea? Is this a trick? Should we do it? I think it would set off a very interesting dynamic inside the Iranian government. It would certainly send a surge of enthusiasm through the beleaguered democratic movement in Iran. But I believe that as we began this negotiating process, we would find that not only are these two countries not fated to be enemies forever, but actually the United States and Iran have great strategic interests in common. We may actually have more in common with Iran over the long term than we do with almost any other Muslim country in the Middle East. Just for a few examples, Iran is the bitter enemy of al-Qaeda and the Taliban. In fact, they were the enemies of those organizations when we were still either cooperating with them or dismissing them as possible threats. They were way ahead of us in fighting those organizations. So their desire to crush the movements represented by the Taliban and al-Qaeda is undiminished and intense. Iran is also very eager to contain destabilization in Iraq. Iran has more ability to stabilize Iraq than any country in the world, including the United States. Iran has already been very helpful, according to what we hear from the Iraqi leaders. And in fact, President Ahmadinejad has even been invited to the so-called pro-American regime in Baghdad, which shows you how that even the Baghdad government understands what Iran has done. However, it is not in Iran's interest at this moment to help produce a totally stable Iraq, because they're afraid that as soon as Iraq is stable, then the United States will use it as a platform to attack Iran. So Iran has this ability to help stabilize Iraq, and will do so in a way that will even allow the United States to carry out a swift military withdrawal. If you believe, as I do, that it should be American policy to withdraw all of our forces from Iraq absolutely as soon as possible, then you must also ask yourself, what's going to happen in the aftermath of that withdrawal? We have, for better or worse, incurred some kind of moral obligation to Iraqis. The Iranians have the ability to stabilize Iraq in a way that will allow us to carry out this very urgent imperative of withdrawing our troops. Iran also has great ability to influence the course of events in Afghanistan. Iran has been involved in Afghanistan for centuries. Iran is even more worried about the destabilization of Pakistan than we are. A broken apart Pakistan with a kind of Talibanized, nuclear-armed rump state will be a greater threat to Iran, a more imminent threat to Iran than it ever would be to the United States. The Iranian oil industry is in terrible condition. There isn't even a single oil refinery in all of Iran. It needs billions of dollars of investment. The United States is perfectly positioned to provide the expertise and the capital for that. Iran is committed to limiting Russian influence in the Middle East. This is also a stated fundamental policy of U.S. Middle East diplomacy. There are endless possibilities for a new relationship with Iran. And this is not something that is a giveaway or a compromise. This is something that is strictly in the cold-blooded national security interests of the United States. It is strictly a matter of realpolitik. The only reason that we haven't been able to embrace this policy is that we're not looking coldly at the facts and trying to look seriously at what's in our own long-term interests. We are too conditioned by emotion. Our policies toward Iran are shaped above all by our emotions. We're trapped in the paradigm of these images from 1979 and the prison of hostility in which we've been imprisoned for 29 years since the Islamic Revolution. Once we can break out of that prison, once we can begin to imagine that the way the world is arranged right now doesn't have to be the way the world is always going to be arranged, then we're going to see that there's possibility out there for a very new relationship that could completely redraw the diplomatic map of the Middle East, could help stabilize that region, could be good for the United States, and could produce the beginnings of a new security architecture that will allow every country in the Middle East some place under the Middle Eastern sun. One of the things that we're doing on this 22-city tour, of which New York is, of course, a part. You're fitting in right in between Omaha and Columbus. Is that we're trying to press for some specific action to come out of these evenings. And one of the things we're asking you to do is to consider signing a postcard. It looks like this. You can receive them right here. This is a postcard to your member of Congress saying that you support a bill which has been introduced in the House that would direct the President of the United States to name a diplomat to begin negotiations with Iran. Now, the mere fact of Congress casting a vote in favor of this bill, or many members of Congress supporting it, I think might not lead to the, in the current administration, to the appointment of some brilliant new diplomat. Probably Dick Cheney would be the one who would be appointed. But it would be a huge symbol to the administration in Washington that there is great opposition to the idea of war, and there is great support for the idea of this alternative. We have the prospect to make a dramatic diplomatic breakthrough with Iran. There is no potential diplomatic move the United States could make anywhere in the world that holds as much potential for long-term benefit to the United States than an opening to Iran. And the only thing that is necessary for us to pursue that policy as individuals and as a government is to turn ourselves inside out and see the world in a new way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kinzer. Now, I know a lot of you have questions, and our speakers are very committed to answering as many questions as possible. And for workability purposes, if you would just let me pick a few people, pick 3 or 4 people to begin with, and then depending on how much time we have, we'll select a few more people. So if you could have a seat just so we can have a great selection of people, you can go ahead first. But I'll pick 3 or 4 people. The lady in the back with the gray, you can come up. Yeah, if we can use that.
As you mentioned, the 2 major pillars against an attack presently is the Department of Defense and the NIE statement. But how solid is the Department of Defense? Because we have, there are Gates, backtracking on the NIE, and we have some neocons around Cheney and Bush. They're more deep cover now. So I just wanted to see if you could possibly explore, how solid the Department of Defense is against an attack.
Fallon, Casey, and Gates have all said, Fallon's statement is, an attack on Iran will not happen on my watch. How solid is it? Well, I think it's solid unless events such as a confrontation, and because both the leaders of Iran, or at least a segment of the leadership in Iran, and there is certainly a significant segment of the Bush White House would like a confrontation, it's possible. Look, we've already had a public demonstration of that with this video released of the Iranian speedboats coming towards, and then they dubbed over this. It turns out this Filipino hacker, that there are powerful forces on each side who see it in their interest, especially with Ahmadinejad's sort of fortunes waning and his allies waning within Iran. But I think it would need a provocation. I think the other thing that we have to remember, and I mentioned it briefly, is that the American military is so deeply degraded. Both in terms of equipment, in terms of morale, in terms of capacity, that the military planners who do the numbers know that launching an attack on Iran would have devastating consequences for the Iranians, but also for us. So I think what we have to guard against in the next 11 months, as Steve said, is some kind of Gulf of Tonkin kind of thing that sweeps up national emotion and national fervor. But I think within the intelligence community and within the military, there is pretty deep-seated opposition to this. Now, Petraeus has come out in favor of, he said that the war in Iraq has to be fought beyond Iraqi borders. There are plenty of generals who, put their career before their integrity. There were people more than willing to step into Checky's shoes or Pace's shoes after he fought with Rumsfeld. So, these generals can be replaced.
Next question. Mr. Kinzer, 2 questions for you. One, what can Iran do to help stabilize the situation in Iraq where negotiations between the U.S. To be started? And 2, how would that affect the other countries in the region, for example, Iran's presence in Lebanon?
How many hours do we have for that one? Let me just say very briefly that Iraq, of course, is a majority Shiite country. The world center of Shiism is in Iran. Many of the most prominent Shiite leaders in Iraq spent decades in exile, living in Iran. Part of Saddam Hussein's policy of repression was to crush the Shiite leadership. I don't think that Iran has the goal to be a hegemonic power in that region, but it wants to have some influence beyond its own borders. It has tremendous influence among many of the large militias and political organizations inside Iraq. And if those organizations hear from their friends in Iran, it's in everybody's interest that we now calm down. We're getting the Americans out. We're going to begin something new. I think that will have a huge impact. I also think that it's important to realize that when the Iranians sent their 2003 offer of negotiation to the United States, it wasn't just an offer saying, let's sit down and decide what we're going to talk about. They actually listed the points that they were willing to talk about. Among those points were recognition of Israel in exchange for the establishment of a Palestinian state, our nuclear program, and specifically our support for Hamas, Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah. These are organizations that respond very much to direction from Iran. And Iran has already expressed the willingness to press them to reduce their violence. But it's only going to make decisive efforts in this direction as part of a comprehensive negotiation. It's not going to give up all of its cards as preconditions. We've gotten to this very odd spot where we feel we've been told that you can't give negotiation, the privilege of negotiating, to a country that engages in what President Bush calls bad behavior. But it's precisely the countries that behave in ways you don't like with whom you need to negotiate. You don't need to negotiate with your friends. You already agree with them.
Yeah, I'm an Iranian American, and I'm proud to be one. This is not really a question. This is a thanks and appreciation, especially to all the panel, especially Mr. Kinzer. I mentioned to him that on that day of 1953 in August, I was a 13-year-old boy, and my house was only 3 blocks from Mossadegh house. So as you see, folks, I'm old, but I'm not ancient. So I saw as the tank rolled with the mob on top of it from Bagh Shah Barrack to Pasteur Avenue to Koch Avenue and blasted Mossadegh house. Your book is the most accurate account of everything happened, street by street, name by name of all the players. And we really, really appreciate it. And we thank you for what you've done.
Next question, please. Well, I also wanted to thank you for your book and the panelists for bringing this topic up. I do think that your comment that the state of affairs has gotten such that if we didn't bomb somebody in the next 11 months is quite a revealing statement, and that would be a good thing, right? And I think that obviously I want to echo Chris's comment on the call for impeachment at a time when we need more than just to not bomb. We have torture being codified, 1 million dead in Iraq. And so my question for the panelists is, what do you see? There's been no speaking so far of the role of the people, of protest, of resistance, especially on a college campus. This has historically been a critical part of stopping and preventing wars. That's a question. And then a comment, I also think that this state of affairs in the world really does call forward and necessitate a reopening of fundamental problem and fundamental solutions and alternatives to empire. And I want to invite people next Sunday, March 9th, we're holding an event, Re-envisioning Revolution and Communism. What is Bob Avakian's new synthesis? I want to invite people because I do think it's a time we need to be talking about a whole different world. So thank you. Thank you.
You know, it is the assault or the potential assault or preemptive war on Iran is, I think, and as I mentioned at the end of my talk, part of a larger problem, which is a breakdown in the rule of law, a breakdown in broad cooperation, decision to speak to the rest of the world exclusively in the language of violence, of destruction of our own civil liberties. And so I think it is all part of a package that I find frightening. I find Iran to be, or the potential for a war with Iran to be part of that component, and I think probably everyone here at the table does as well.
If I could make an observation that may not be directly on the point of your question, but I don't know how recently my fellow panelists have been to Tehran, but last time I was there, there was an enormous billboard on one of the main thoroughfares. Millions of Iranians travel over to get to work every day. An enormous billboard with the photograph, the infamous photograph of Abu Ghraib, of the detainee with his arms extended and the black hood over his head. And this is part, obviously, of Iranian propaganda. I make that observation because we have opened ourselves to that propaganda, and any kind of activism that is concerned about the future of Iranian-American relations or of war with Iran needs to take into consideration the full measure of our own counterinsurgency, counterterrorism measures, and any effective campaign to prevent war needs to bear in mind that our own credibility in the world is at stake, and we need to be putting pressure on our leaders to restore our own reputation in the world.
Thank you. Next question. Thank you all for being here. I'm a Columbia student. My question is for Stephen Kinzer. First of all, I loved your book. Absolutely fascinated with it. All the Shah's Men. So fascinated that I bought almost every other book that you used, including Kermit Roosevelt's memoir. So, yeah. My question for you is, you stated that the reason we have not yet engaged in diplomatic relations with Iran is because we are so bogged down with the past, specifically pointing at the hostage situation. But I would actually like to ask, because this is what I believe, I think really the reason is our interest, or is actually Israel's interests. So I'd just like to know what your opinion on that is.
So the question, for those of you that didn't hear it, was about what Israel's role in this. Isn't that part of the reason why the U.S. has not been able to engage Iran? You know, those of us that cover the Middle East are always interested to notice, particularly when you're in Israel, that the spectrum of allowable opinion or acceptable opinion on what Israel should be and what Israel should do is much wider in Israel than it is in the United States. There are mainstream politicians in Israel that make statements every day that would be inconceivable for any member of the U.S. Congress. But yet, we're not just captive to Israel's interest or Israel's expressed interest. We're captive to one small segment that has managed, in a highly effective and very legal way, to exercise enormous influence on the political process of our country. But in the end, why is Iran interested in a nuclear program and potentially a nuclear weapon? It's because Iran has fear. Iran is afraid. Why is Israel so heavily armed and having a nuclear program? Israel is also afraid. These kinds of negotiations are ways to ratchet down the fear and give people a sense that everybody can have a place at the table. I'd like to see these kinds of negotiations try to go even beyond the bilateral issues of Iran and the United States. Perhaps there could be some joint access to a civilian supply of nuclear fuel. Perhaps there could be symmetric inspections of the nuclear programs of all countries in the region. It's true, you cannot reach a really new security architecture in the Middle East without concessions from all countries. That certainly includes concessions from Israel, and it's going to take an American administration with a little creativity to do this. Now, a negotiating process like this is not guaranteed to succeed. It's the nature of negotiations that they take their own course, and you can't see what's going to happen at the end. But this process is so low cost. It doesn't cost us anything to try. And to go into a war without having legitimately exhausted all peaceful options is completely immoral. Therefore, we've got the option here at almost no cost to try a policy that I think can unlock some of the boxes in which we've been imprisoned all these years.
Thank you. Next question.
Yes, I guess this is for Chris Hedges or Mr. Kinzer or whoever, but if it's true, as I understand it, that the original colonization of the Middle East by the British at the end of World War I was largely influenced by oil, and the overthrow of Mossadegh was precipitated by his nationalization of the oil industry. I'm curious that we haven't heard anything tonight about the role of the U.S. oil companies or the international oil megaton, and I'd like you to comment on what role these powers are playing that seem to me often influence our national policy.
Well, I actually thought that was going to come at the end of the last question when she said, but there's one big factor nobody's considered. And she said Israel, but I thought it was going to be oil. So there are plenty of things we haven't brought up yet. Actually, I think my favorite line in the entire Iraq War project came from Rumsfeld, and I think I've got it memorized verbatim. This war has nothing to do, literally nothing to do with oil. That was the Pinocchio moment #1 for the Bush administration project in Iraq. It's just common sense that big powers do not shape their policy toward the Middle East without thinking about oil. Once I got a chance to hear the Dalai Lama, and he was asked about the Chinese takeover of Tibet in the 1950s. As you know, China just gobbled up Tibet, and nobody in the world tried to stop them, and nobody did anything or said anything about it. And so the Dalai Lama was asked, what was your reaction to all of this? And he has that little giggle which he gave, and then he said, so sad that Tibet has no oil. There is no doubt that American oil companies are playing a big role in shaping American policy toward the Middle East. I actually think maybe one way to pacify them would be to tell them the Iran oil industry needs $10 billion of investment. How about Halliburton? You can do it. If you just stop pushing us for war, we'll find something else to keep your people busy. So obviously, in the long run, it is hugely important for the United States to break out of the slavish fealty that we have to the sheiks who are financing radical fundamentalist groups all over the world, while our president is holding hands and dancing the sword dance with them, and then begging them in public not to increase the price of oil. How humiliating is that? We have really fallen to the position where we're not just privately but publicly the slave of a handful of people who, by geographical accident, have come to control these great oil supplies. We need to break away from our reliance on oil and stop financing our own assassins with this deadly addiction.
Thank you. Next question.
I don't know if everyone's seen the television commercial that's been running this week, urging everyone to call their congressman to vote for the Senate FISA bill. I don't know who's behind that. But my question to the panelists, do you think that the students in '79 had more justification to hold the American diplomats hostage because they feared a replay of what we had done, overthrowing the government in '53, than the United States had justification for arresting diplomats in Iraq last year, a country where we had no business being in the first place?
Well, I think it's wrong in both cases. I was reminded when I think Professor Abrahamian was, I think you said something to the effect of, if I were an Iranian leader right now, I would make the calculation that it would be in our interest to develop some form of nuclear capability. One of the people I've interviewed in the course of my own book is Michael Matrinko, who was one of the hostages who was treated most woefully during the hostage affair, and he said, if I were a student in 1979 in Iran, I would have been one of the hostage takers. In hindsight, the hostage takers themselves regret it. In hindsight, we may one day regret the hostages that we have there. It is a war zone. There are allegations that Iranians are killing Americans. It's a complex environment. I don't know all of the evidence against the Iranians. Much of what I know suggests that our evidence isn't very good in that and many other cases. But it is a complex environment. All I can say is that if someone like Michael Matrinko can say with the benefit of hindsight that he can understand why the Iranian students did what they did at the time, it's a more complex story than maybe we realize.
Thank you. We really have time for just one last question, please.
I'll try to make this as short as possible. There are, first of all, thanks to the panel. Thanks to the panel, and we need things like this all over this country and every day, and we need also to act upon all the recommendations. There are a few things that especially Chris Hedges, comparing Ahmadinejad with Bush is, where's the comparison? I don't think Ahmadinejad has been responsible for attacking and murdering over a million people.
Could I just ask you to ask a question, please?
I do have a question. And the other thing is that Iranian actions are always called supporting terrorism, and American actions are never called. All over the world, we are terrorists, biggest terrorists around the world. Here's my question. What moral superiority does the U.S. have with all of its history soaked with the blood of innocent people that we keep talking about moral superiority?
Well, I don't know how you could have heard 30 minutes of my talk and thought I was championing American moral superiority. I think like Steve, I spent 20 years of my life outside the United States, starting in covering the wars in Guatemala, El Salvador, and the Contra War in Nicaragua. I mean, I've seen the terrorism that we support, whether that's in Angola or, the use of American F-16 fighters bombing Jabalia and Hana Yunis, or, so I certainly, I think, like Steve, both of us have spent years and years writing about the complicity of the United States in morally repugnant acts, and I think that what we're trying to do, all of us who are sitting here, is make sure that there isn't another one. Thanks.
Thank you. I want to thank our four speakers for taking the time to be here. I want to thank you for sharing your expertise on this very important subject. I also want to thank you for the courage it takes to stand up and say something when against the way that the world is going. I want to thank our sponsors for this special evening, and I also want to thank each and every one of you, because I know there's a lot of different places you could have been, and you chose to be here, and I want to thank you for caring. I want to thank you for listening. And I know, and our speakers know, that their message only exists in your listening, so thank you. And if you want to support the organizations that help put this event together, please see the leaders in the back of the room.